Yes, I think it's very likely to happen towards the end of January, beginning of February, in all likelihood.
On what grounds do you believe that?
Well, there are several. First of all, the problems in Ukraine are not new. We've been dealing with them for the last, I would argue, 10 to 15 years. These problems were evident in the 1990s when the former Soviet Union fragmented into various states. The current borders of Ukraine never made a great deal of sense because Ukraine is essentially a multinational state. You have in the east, that is beyond the Dnieper River, to the south down to Odessa on the coast, what is really a Russian population. The rest of Ukraine is actually historic Ukraine that goes back to the Polish Lithuanian Commonwealth. And that part of Ukraine is inhabited by true Ukrainians in terms of ethnicity as well as culture and language. Putting this together has always been problematic, particularly because Ukrainians have wanted to turn the Russians into Ukrainians. The Russians aren't terribly excited about that prospect and have complained bitterly about it. And Putin, from the very beginning of his presidency, tried to make it clear to anyone who would listen that there were certain things that he would not tolerate as the Russian head of state. And one of those was that Ukraine become a member of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. He also had concerns about the EU because that was seen as another mechanism with which to integrate Ukraine into the West. Then finally, he became very concerned about the plight of the Russians. Crimea is historically never part of Ukraine and has been part of Russia since 1776. And so he was anxious to relieve that burden on the Russians in Crimea by driving the Ukrainians out, and he did that in 2014. But he also wanted to ensure that we understood that we were never going to be able to use Crimea, the Crimean Peninsula, and the ports on the Crimean Peninsula for NATO naval forces or any other forces. We didn't pay any attention. We attacked him viciously. We essentially ignored any of his expression of concern or interest in Ukraine from the standpoint of Moscow's national security. And we have always refused to acknowledge the Russian concern that NATO is threatening to Russia. We've insisted absolutely not. But we don't have far to look over the last 20 years at the various regime change operations that Washington has staged to appreciate Putin's concerns. But instead of addressing those concerns in a substantive way, taking into account what Russia's interests are, we've essentially said that they're illegitimate. And the only interests that are legitimate are our own and those of our quote unquote NATO allies. So here we sit. We're looking at a force of 130, 150, 180,000. I don't know what it will be when the day approaches, but a force that is substantial enough to seize the Russian-speaking areas that are east of the Dnieper River and, frankly, all the way out to Odessa if he decides to do it. There's not a great deal we can do about it.
I know that Russia already has, senior military forces there, is providing military equipment to its allies in Ukraine. But I mean, a full scale invasion. Do you think? I mean, practically, Russia has summoned the necessary forces to pull off such a thing? And do you think Putin would want the burden of a full on military invasion of Ukraine? That seems to be a much higher escalation than what he's already done. And I just wonder if even if he wanted to, whether that's even feasible from a Russian point of view.
Oh, it's absolutely feasible, particularly when you look at the map and you see that he will confine his operations to the Russian-speaking areas. In many cases, I think the Russians will be welcomed as liberators. They're certainly not going to be heavily resisted by the Russian population. The resistance will come from Ukrainians. But in those areas where he's going to go, there are very few Ukrainians, if any at all. And the only Ukrainians who are there are from the Ukrainian armed forces. So I don't think that's the concern. Now, as far as launching the operation at all, I don't think Vladimir Putin has wanted to do it for a long time. But I think he feels that he has no choice. He's left no alternative because we absolutely will not acknowledge his national strategic interest in Ukraine. From the very beginning, We could have approached Ukraine very differently, but this is the biggest problem. What are our goals in Ukraine? Our goals should be that Ukraine remains independent, sovereign, free, and that may or may not have anything to do with membership in NATO. But we haven't been willing to consider that. A lot of us, I'm one of them, argued very early that the obvious solution would be Austrian style neutrality for Ukraine. Simply no foreign bases or forces in the country that would be threatening to Russian interests, and a willingness to let Ukraine vote its own future. If it wants to stay together, it may do so. If it doesn't, then we can certainly look at a territorial arrangement which allows the Russian areas to join Russia. Now, about 10 years ago, I think most of the population, even the Russians, said, no, let's just hold this construct together. I don't think that's the case anymore. And I think if given the choice, most of the Russians in the East would now prefer to be part of Russia. So I don't think going into Ukraine from that standpoint is a big issue for Vladimir Putin. Now, what he will not do, Aaron, is cross the Dnieper River and go into Ukraine proper, where you've got 25 million or so committed, devoted Ukrainians who will fight like hell. He doesn't want to deal with it. He's not interested in that. He's only interested in the territory, as far as I can tell, up to the Dnieper River and potentially out to Odessa. That is what he has been calling Novorussia, New Russia, which is a term that first came into use under Catherine the Great, when Catherine the Great's armies ultimately conquered Crimea and essentially designated those areas as New Russia. Because before 1776, the areas that we're talking about in eastern Ukraine and Crimea were part of a Tartar Mongol Muslim Khanate for several hundred years. So, bottom line is, I don't think he wants to do it, but I think he feels he has to protect the Russians that are there. He has to force this in order to get the attention of the United States and its NATO allies. I think it's going to work. I think he will. Now, how will that turn out in the long term? Well, we can speculate about all the potential consequences, but he can do it.
All right. So Russia has made its goals clear. It wants to keep Ukraine out of NATO. It wants a binding pledge that will keep Ukraine out of NATO, and also wants guarantees against the positioning of U.S. weapons, offensive U.S. weapons inside Ukraine. I'm wondering your assessment of the U.S. goals, and specifically how the Nord Stream 2 gas pipeline factors into all of this, or if you think it does. Right now, this Nord Stream 2 gas pipeline, it's under this review period in Germany. If it goes ahead, it will, further integrate Russia into the rest of Europe, and Ukraine will be bypassed. It will lose out on billions of dollars in transit fees that it collects by basically being a pass-through for Russian gas. I'm wondering if you agree with analysts who say that what the U.S. and Ukraine are doing in adopting a bellicose posture right now is basically jockeying for better leverage over Nord Stream 2 and limiting the extent to which Russia will benefit from that deal if it goes ahead.
Well, I suppose you could argue that that's part of it. But frankly, the Germans have looked to Russia for a very long time as a source of liquefied natural gas and other minerals. Keep in mind that in 1914, when World War I broke out, Russia was Germany's number one trading partner, and Germany was Russia's number one trading partner. And again, on the 22nd of June, 1941, Russia was Germany's number one trading partner, and Germany was Russia's number one trading partner. The Germans and the Russians, frankly speaking, with the exception of those two world wars, which are very anomalous, actually have a long history of cooperation. And I think the Germans and the Russians would like to get back to that because each has something the other needs. The Germans need Russia's vast natural resources, mineral resources, as well as oil and gas, timber, other things. And the Germans have the finished machine tool products, the engines, many of the technologies for automobiles and aircraft and so forth that the Russians need. So this is not a spur of the moment decision by the Germans. The second point is the Germans want to shut down all of their nuclear reactors. They want to become independent of nuclear power. The only way to do that is with more liquefied natural gas. Now, we have stepped up to the plate and offered to sell the liquefied natural gas to them. The problem is we can't sell it to them as cheaply as the Russians can. And the Russians can sell it much more cheaply and much faster, not only to Germany, but to the Netherlands, to Belgium, to Austria, Hungary, all the people in Central Europe who need liquefied natural gas through Nord Stream 2, then they can get it through Ukraine. So I think in this sense, Ukraine is bound to lose simply because the Russians have found a faster, cheaper, better solution for their European clients. I think it's also important to keep in mind that Russia does not have the military capacity that it did 30, 40 years ago. And that is to say, there is no theater offensive capability any longer. And frankly, Vladimir Putin has no aspirations to conquer Europe. So both sides want to do business. And again, President Trump concluded, well, if this is the case, then why are we in Europe ostensibly to protect Germany and these other allies from the Russians? Because they obviously don't feel threatened. And of course, his point was valid. We have to come to terms with reality that this Nord Stream 2 probably is going to happen. It may be delayed a little bit by the new German government, but the German people don't want to freeze through the winter. Everybody needs liquefied natural gas for heating in Central Europe. So I think that barrier will come down. Ukraine has to decide how it wants to go forward with its Russian neighbor. And we have never said to the Ukrainians, you must get along with your neighbor. Instead, what we said is, by all means, be hostile. And we want to come in and we want to use your country as a platform to attack Russia. And when I say attack Russia, I'm not suggesting that we want to attack Russia militarily, but we want to use it as a platform with which to subvert the Russian government and potentially destabilize its society. This goes back to the regime change problem that I mentioned earlier. And the Russians aren't going to accept any excuses or arguments from us that our presence there will be benign. They see no evidence for that benign presence. They see the opposite, which is why Lukashenko in White Russia, or Belarus, has moved so quickly with Putin to ensure that his regime is stable and White Russia cannot go the way of Ukraine.